Now, there's a very interesting idea in mathematics. A group of mathematicians, there's about 500 of them, do not publish with their own names. They publish under the same name, Bourbaki. So in other words, no one is getting credit for it. And it's kind of a political idea, like a communist idea, that all of the research is done collectively and it doesn't matter who gets credit for it. It's not widely used, but it's an interesting idea that the important thing is not getting credit, but it's getting the research out. But only mathematicians do it. No one else has ever done this idea of Bourbaki. So, now, when you leave the university, you will probably be publishing your research. But you always use the address where you conducted the research. So you would always say that the research was at Osaka Prefecture University, even if you were at Nara Women's University or University of Kyoto. You always use the address where the research was done. Okay, so what's the important thing I want you to remember about authorship? First of all, there may be a big sequence of authors, many authors. But you always know the first author was the one that really did most of the research, most of the writing. You know that the last author was probably the head of the laboratory of the institute where the research was done. If there are only 2 or 3 authors, everybody gets the same credit. If there are 10 or more authors, it begins to be a problem where the only ones that will really get the credit are the first ones and the last ones. With 2 authors, 3 authors, 4 authors, it doesn't really matter. But when you get a large sequence, that's when it becomes important. Now, I also want to mention is that many arguments and disagreements have developed over who should be included in authorship. And if I could leave you with one idea, if you're not sure if somebody should be included, it's always better to include them than to not include them. Because not including them, you could make an enemy for the rest of your life that will never forget that. So that really is kind of just a little bit of experience. It's better to include people than not to include them if they have made a contribution. Okay, let's go on a little further. So what we've done is we're looking down at the paper from the start. The first thing we see is the title and the author. And now let's see what's next. Well, the abstract. The abstract. Now, the abstract is typically set by the journal that you publish in. It may be a certain percentage of the length of the article, for example, 1 to 3%, or it may be a specific number of words, say 250 or less. But it will be set by the journal. And one of the things that happens now is because we submit our papers electronically, if the abstract is too long, the submission actually counts the words, and they will just send it back until you reduce the number of words. So this is one of the things that's very important, is to follow this guideline specific to the journal about how long the abstract should be. Now, after the title, it is the second most important part. What the abstract does, it covers 4 topics, the same that the paper does, but it emphasizes different things. The abstract will state the principal objectives and the scope of the study. It doesn't necessarily give all of the information that's covered in the introduction, but it really says what is the importance of this study. It describes briefly, very briefly, the methods that are used. It summarizes the results, does not have a lot about the discussion, but instead states the principal conclusion. Because if you think about say 150 words, that's only about 10 sentences. It's not very long. The abstract has to be concise, and this is kind of a good way to think about what you want to end with. You may take all your topic sentences from the article, but you really want to condense them so you have these 4 parts. The principal objectives, briefly describe the methods that are used, summarize the results, and state the principal conclusions. Okay, this is very important that it be condensed to that. Now, there's a few things about abstracts that people tend to do that are big common mistakes. Usually they include far too much detail. Remember, if a person reads the abstract and finds your article of interest, they'll read the whole article. So you don't need to have too much detail. Another thing is you can't, in the abstract, refer to articles. You don't cite references in the abstract, or you don't talk about a figure that the person would have to go to the paper, because very often you can find abstracts online, but not the entire paper. You would have to go to the library or buy the entire paper. So it has to be able to be read without referring to the specific article. So you avoid references. Now, this is the most common problem with abstracts. These words. The idea of so-and-so is discussed, or new information is presented, or the research is summarized. Never, if a word like that appears, you know it's a mistake. Because think of the words discussed, presented, summarized. They don't mean anything. They don't give any information at all. So you never should use any of these words in your abstract. Discussed or presented, reported, summarized. Say what you found, not kind of a general term. Okay, so let's kind of just review what we've talked about. How are we on time? 25 minutes left. Great. Okay. So let's kind of talk about what we've discussed. The title is the most important part of the paper. It is the most important part. Unfortunately, they may judge your entire paper based on the title. Now, you want to make sure you give enough information in the title, but you can't give too much. Like you can't say, you know, you're talking about biochemistry or microbiology, and it may have a little bit of cancer implication, cancer research implication. You can't entitle it A Cure for Cancer, okay? Because it has to be relevant to what your article really reports. You can't make it more than it really is. Avoid words like studies on, investigations of. Make it a label, a descriptor, not a sentence. Okay, authorship. Remember, the 2 places that everybody understands in a sequence of author is the first author and the last author. In terms of abstracts, remember, you state the objectives. You briefly talk about the methods that you used. You summarize the results, and you emphasize the conclusions. You always avoid words like summarized and discussed and reported. Never use any of those words in an abstract. All right, before we go on, are there any questions or anything you want me to discuss in a little more detail? Anything that you think would be good to discuss?